Hello, everyone. I'm back. I have a friend. Want to say hi, Morgan? Mm-hmm. She doesn't want to say hi. So we're going to go ahead with Chapter 5. The sun is right in my eyes, yay. I will try to not get too distracted by the cute cat grooming in the window. You are so precious. All right, Chapter 5. We were at home again. This was a set-off for the misfortunes with which a wretched fate had loaded us. The house was as snug as we had left it, and we had but to return to our old habits. So we did, and exactly. The cake we had left at our flight was still lying on the table. As we were hungry, we each snatched our share and ate it with a ravenous appetite. It was a bit hard, but all the same delicious. We wandered through the house with joy. We were at home again. How many of those who had fled from the invasion had renounced the pleasures of home for months or even years? Some of our friends at Morny had not yet come back. Yet could we pity them? 1,000 times no. At least they would never endure the trials to which the conquered are exposed, and which, after a momentary calm, once more had depressed us. The presence of the Germans quartered in the village seemed unbearable. Ah, poor snails that we were! In spite of our efforts, the flood had overtaken and submerged us. The tree we tried to climb was too low. The inundation covered everything, and we could not foresee the end of the nightmare. How long should we have to groan and struggle in that all-devouring water? We besought God to deliver us, and God seemed deaf to our prayers and blind to our tears. We called to you who were on the mainland over the mountains, insurmountable as the Great Wall of China. Our hearts called to you, and no one answered. For a fortnight the floods had been out, and already we were losing patience. Morally drowned as we were, we still had a physical need of food. A household of 7 persons and 2 dogs must furnish its larder and cellar with abundant provisions. The grocers of the village had but empty shops. Our neighbors were unhumbled because each was the owner of a plot of ground. Less favored than the poorest of the poor, we had no crop at all. What would become of us? I have said we had no crop. I was wrong. We even had a superb crop. The pear trees, even those which these last 15 years had yielded no fruit at all, had deemed it a point of honor to do their best in hard times, and were all laden with huge plump pears, which made your mouth water. They were not ripe yet, but determined not to tempt the green-uniformed marauders, we made up our minds to gather them. For 2 days we picked them and filled basket upon basket with pears, long or round, green or yellow. Then there was the problem to solve where to hide them. We laid our heads together and by unanimous consent decided upon that deserter's attic. On one side the attic was full of faggots, on the other, behind the chimney that comes up from the wash-house, there was a floor space, about 8 feet square, and there we laid our beautiful pears amid shreds of paper instead of straw. To conceal their retreat, we heaped up at the entrance old boxes, hen coops, and a garden roller in elaborate disorder. Nobody would ever have thought that this innocent pile of rubbish was a treasure hoard. But we who knew put 1 foot here, another there, and at a bound we were on the floor in the very abode of the pears, where cunning paths allowed us to visit our friends and choose the juiciest among them. We never made these visits without a groan, for we always forgot the existence of a big cistern fitted up in the roof, and constantly knocked our heads against this iron ceiling. But the shock itself kindled our imagination and struck out a flash of genius. Suppose we put the wine into the cistern. We thought we had given all our wine to the French soldiers, and then we discovered in the bottom of a box about 30 bottles, which we resolved to hide from the Germans' thirst. I must admit that our sobriety equals the camels. We drink hardly anything besides water. A bottle of wine a week satisfies the needs of the whole family. But all the same, we did not want our wine to moisten German throats. So through the yard, up the ladder, over the boxes, the bottles went their way. Not too well poised on a tottering scaffolding, I wriggled into the narrow space between the beam and the cistern. I held out a groping hand, into which was placed the neck of a bottle, and little by little the receptacle was filled. We went quickly to work. My sister-in-law carried up the bottles with care. I laid them down with a gentle hand. For it is well known that a Prussian ear detects the clinking of bottles a mile off, and of course the Prussian, contiguous to the ear, being forewarned, rests not until he has secured the two imprudent bottles. But all of a sudden I was aroused by a loud shout, instantly hushed to discreet silence. I jumped down from my scaffold, leapt over the pears, scaled the boxes, tumbled down the ladder, and found myself in the midst of a perplexed group. Grandmother, what is the matter? Yvonne and Colette, prying in the cellar, had discovered a fair-sized keg which gurgled when it was shaken. The treasure hunters thrust in the bung with an effort, inserted a tap, drew out a glass of the liquor, and brought it to me. What is it? Unctuous yellowish substance. Was it oil or syrup? I looked at it, shook the glass, smelt it, even tasted a drop with the tip of my tongue, then announced, "It is glucose." Glucose, and we had no sugar left. Every morning we drank milk and coffee unsweetened by honey. Madame Valenne declared my diagnosis right, and we leapt for joy like marionettes. There was no more meat, no butter, and eggs were uncommonly rare, but sweetened dishes take the place of everything. Baskets full of pears, a keg of glucose, 30 bottles of wine. Who talked of dearth? For truth's sake, I must say glucose did not answer as well as we expected. When I tried to sweeten the milk with it, the milk turned sour, and with the experiment also, to my shame. On the other hand, by stewing the beloved pears with glucose and wine, I obtained an unforgettable dish over which a jury of cooks greedily licked its lips. And every other evening, for 2 months, our scanty menu was thus composed: soup, stewed pears, bread at discretion, fresh water at will. The glucose went to keep the wine company in the cistern, except for a few bottles of either liquid, which we craftily concealed in the garden, and in case of need we had but to cry out, "Pierrot, go and fetch the bottle that is in the reeds, or in the blue fir, or in the big yew." It was much more amusing than simply to go down into the cellar. Thus our life was not uninteresting, but our chief occupation was to watch the horizon, east and south, where our soldiers were fighting. The guns were coming sensibly nearer. We heard them growl day and night, and when it grew dark we saw shells burst above the hills. We spent many hours in the garden, looking out for these illuminations, hoping we might understand something from the way they went. Then came the gleam of an explosive, striping the sky with a flash of lightning or with a slow trail of light. The better to observe, we got up the ladder and sat on the wall. To the casual passer-by, we might have resembled a flock of crows at roost, waiting for gossip's tales. Madame Valenne had no taste for these perilous exercises, and contented herself with the stories we told her. For us, the only spectacle we thought worthwhile was that very one which almost rent our hearts. How eagerly we wished for the shells to burst nearer, nearer, to set the house in a blaze, so that we might be set free from our chains. About the 25th of September took place the first shock between us and the German army. It was nearly 8 o'clock in the evening. The supper over, I went into the garden and was peering at the dark sky, heedless of the cold wind which caused my hair and shawl to flutter, when a frightful uproar broke the silence. Gruff voices cried out vociferously. Heavy boots kicked at the gates. The angry dogs barked till they choked. Good heavens, what is happening? I threw myself down the ladder, fled through the garden, those days were full of wild races, got to the house and saw Geneviève hasten forth, a key in her hand. They want us to open the gate, she said, and we must. Yvonne seized the dogs by the collar and dragged them in. The gate was hardly unlocked when those without threw it open and at the same time overran the yard. They were furious, and one of them shouted in bad French, "When the Germans knock at a door, it should be opened immediately." "You think so, do you, you Boche?" On hearing us speak fluent German, they softened and looked at us in amazement. They all had the same round faces, which the lantern of an under-officer lit up. They wanted a lodging, barns, stables to shelter men and horses. All that was difficult to get. There is room but for 1 horse in the stable. Well, that will do for 2 horses and 2 men. And here is the wash-house. 6 men will sleep there. The others withdrew to look for a lodging somewhere else. The remainder, who seemed to be harmless blockheads, were convoys. We heaved a deep sigh, but hardly had a mouthful of air reached our lungs when the yard was already swarming with a new mob. Standing on the steps, I engaged in parley with the feldwebel. The house is chock full, and 8 soldiers are already lodged in the outhouses. He was young, big, and stout, and his hard-featured face was deeply scarred. Of course he did not allow himself to be prevailed upon. "It is all the same to me," he answered. "Make room for me if you have none." He ordered me to open the coach-house, but when he saw it crammed up with all sorts of things, he made a wry face. "And up there?" he asked, pointing at the deserter's attic. Good heavens, the pears, the wine! I was trembling with fear, and was at a loss how to answer when the man altered his mind. "I would rather have a bedroom to myself," and so saying, he opened Antoinette's door. "That will do," said the person, and waving back the silently waiting soldiers, he kept but 2 of them with him. We began to remove a few things from the room, which Antoinette had always kept for herself, and before the sergeant's taunting eyes we carried away clothes, books, and knickknacks. The door we had left ajar was suddenly thrown open, and a little coxcomb of an officer came in and cried out in a cheerful tone, "Oh, oh, 2 at a time!" That was more than we could stand, and leaving blankets and coverlets, we ran away. At the corner of the house, a brutal arm stopped me, and a soldier I hardly saw in the night muttered something I did not understand about money, 5 francs. I tried to break loose from the man's hold, and answered at random, we were no shopkeepers and sold nothing. "If you are busy," he said, "another lady would do." In the dim light of a glimmering window, I caught sight of a Slavonic-featured, black-bearded, sneaking-eyed face that belonged to one of the stable-dwellers, a perfect brute. He looked so strange, his voice was so peculiar, that I suddenly understood the meaning of his words. Frightened, I shook my arm to get it free, set off running, and got so quickly out of sight he might have believed I had been swallowed up by the night. I rushed into the house, banged the door, turned the key in it, pushed the bolts, and even then I was not sure I was secure. I wished for padlocks, bars, chains to protect us against such creatures. We thought we would never dare go to bed. With Madame Valenne, I went through the house to test the wooden shutters. In the street, the carts of the convoy stood close to the house. Here and there we saw a lantern glimmer. Lying under the awnings, the drivers tumbled and tossed, and from time to time uttered heavy groans. Those carts reminded us of monstrous beasts, hunchbacked and mischievous, which squatted at our door to watch and threaten us. The yard was pitch dark. All seemed to be in a sound sleep, but for the horses, which kicked and pawed the ground of the narrow stable. The men were snoring, the dogs shut up in the lobby whined gently. We talked in a low voice and went on tiptoe. In our own house we felt beset with dangers and cares. Without taking off our clothes, we laid ourselves down, our eyes wide open, our ears attentive to all outside sounds, our nerves on edge. So we waited for the break of day. The Germans got up at the first glimmer of a misty sun, and we watched them through the trellised shutters. They had cooked a potato soup, a gray and sticky stuff, to which they added some brandy, and which they ate without conviction. For hours together they peeled vegetables, hummed tunes, whistled, dawdled up and down, but they never drew a drop of water from the pump, and they seemed wholly unacquainted with the fact that a human being ought to wash. Then they began cleaning their arms most carefully, and deluged them with petroleum and oil. Our amazement was the same which the sight of wigwams or niggers' cabins might have roused, seen for the first time. Their guns, leaning against the gate, confirmed this impression. Real savages' arms, the bayonets were about a hand's breadth, and notched like a saw. At the mere thought of the wounds such teeth would make in the flesh, an icy chill ran through our veins. About 9, after half an hour's monotonous shouting, the convoy filed off, and soon after vanished from sight. As soon as they were gone, we rushed out. The street swarmed with people, like an ant-hill which a clumsy foot has trodden on. Well, well, German boots leave traces. The high street of Morny had never before witnessed such filth. On all sides lay dirty straw, muddy rags, formless scraps of iron. The horse dung looked clean compared with the rest. As to ourselves, we cried with horror at the sight of our poor yard, into which we could not put our foot. Oily pools stood here and there. The pavement, bespattered with mud, was covered all over with dirty rags, greasy papers, vegetable peelings, and overtopping all the rest, what Antoinette pompously called human dejections. And yet in a corner of the garden was a closet formerly intended for the gardener. But such people! Disgusted and bewailing, old Tassin spent the whole afternoon in cleaning the yard, and made more than one unpleasant discovery, such as about 40 pounds of rotten meat concealed in the straw. The small room was in a sorry plight. The panders had emptied the ink pot into a work table, scribbled the walls all over, broken a vase, taken away a woolen blanket, an eiderdown, and a door curtain. As to the mattress and the spring mattress, we could not have touched them with a pair of tongs, covered as they were with spots of grease. It is agreeable to receive Germans. Antoinette instantly made up her mind to change her room, and easily transformed one of the attics. We went roundly to work, and the small room was soon as empty as a Pomeranian's head. We had made up our minds that the creatures should bring straw with them if they required hospitality a second time. To the King of Prussia himself we would have grudged a bed, lest he should leave it in as bad a condition as his men. The convoy came back that very evening. Our guests of yesterday went back to their lodging. Only the inhabitants of the small room did not return. Perhaps what was left them of conscience reproached them with theft. Early in the morning the carts went off, and after 3 hours' work, old Tassin declared he had removed all traces of their second visit. The whole village complained that the rascals had not only dirtied whatever they approached, but had stolen what they wanted, wasted provender and oats, and had thrown down whole sheaves of wheat for their horses to lie on. In the first weeks of the occupation, the invaders bled the country to death. In Morny, they took thousands of fowls, hundreds of pigs and sheep, and I don't know how many horses and cows. Monsieur Lantois' black bull, which his ravishers had tethered to a cart and then abandoned in the middle of the road, protested in a wild, fierce, and fitful roar that he repeated every other minute for hours together. The farmers dreaded marauders still more than official requisitions. For what was requisitioned they obtained. If they insisted, a note of hand, often scribbled in pencil and almost illegible, but at least proving they had been deprived of something. The soldiers, of course, took an unfair advantage of their victims, who knew not German, and cheated them in every way. We were often asked to translate such IOUs as had been composed according to the writer's own fancy. Paid and carried away a horse, wrote one requisitioner who had but paid with lies. Exchanged 2 horses of equal worth, another pretended, when a broken-down hack had supplied the place of a good mare. Received 40 pounds of bacon, and the honest customer knew he had gained 450 kilograms on the pork butcher. In spite of all, the country people attached great importance to these notes of hand, and the marauders gave them none. They went 2 or 3 together, got into the houses when the people were working out in the fields, searched them from top to bottom, and laid hands on what pleased them. They stripped the hen houses and the dovecotes. They would drop in unawares when the people were about to sit down to dinner, and then divert themselves by seizing and feasting upon the dishes before the balked peasants' very faces. Thus eaten out of house and home, the village would soon be starved. The mayor of Morny and Monsieur Launay resolved to go to Léon and seek some protection against the raiders. The answer they got from the Germans was that, first, rural matters were no concern of theirs, and secondly, that the people were expected to give everything the soldiers asked for. A word to the wise is enough. Those who have not known the evils of invasion cannot imagine the rage and despair which filled our hearts at being thus enslaved and ground down. Impotent wrath, overwhelming despondency took hold of our souls, at once humiliated and revolted. Like true civilized people, we could not understand why we were forbidden to claim justice, to seek redress, why we were expected to yield to brute strength. And there was no use to cry out for help, to crave assistance. It seemed to us that we were forsaken by God and men. But was the trap shut tight? Were we, for instance, whose interests, life, and dearest affections lay on the other side of the front, without means to break through the enemy's barrier? Were we actually prisoners? My mother-in-law made up her mind to go to Léon in order to consult competent judges. I was to accompany her. This poor Léon, which I had seen but a few weeks ago bright with French animation, in what state did we find it? We saw a few civilians only, with hard and hostile faces. On the other hand, there were a great many gray-clad Germans in the streets with their helmets on, bustling about in the best of humor. They seemed at home everywhere and masters of all the houses. Most shops were shut up. I tried to get into the only one I saw open, but nobody was in it. Only in the recesses of the back shop a big hand was busy about a saucepan, and heavy steps shook the spiral staircase. It is easy to understand that I had had enough of it, and that I hastened out with all possible speed. The sight of their forsaken shops would have rent the hearts of the owners had they been gifted with second sight. One of them, I suppose it was a grocer's, had been smashed to atoms. Glass jars, drawers, looking-glasses were but things of the past, and the floor was covered all over with a litter 20 inches high of biscuits, sweets, macaroni, rice, and odds and ends of all kinds. We went to see the mayor and asked him the questions which we were anxious to have answered. Were the Germans to settle in the country? Was it possible to go to Paris? His answer was like a death knell. Nothing was to be done. The Germans were not likely to clear out. He deemed it folly to try to go away. I left the room heartbroken. We arrived in Morny just in time to see some German infantry march through the street. They came from the front, and their ill looks filled us with joy. They trudged along with weary faces and were all muddy and bent as if with old age. "Just look at them," we said. "Where do they come from? Surely they are beaten men. Is the French army advancing?" Colette, hidden behind the curtains, never failed to throw her wishes after the Germans as they passed through the village. "Die, die, die! Die, you nasty red-haired fellow! Die, you fat brute! Die, you young whippersnapper! Oh, a wounded man! Die too, poor wretch! Die, die, die!" And the litany drew to a close only when the regiment had filed off. "That is to help the French," said she. Many an adventure befell us in the month of October. I can merely refer, for instance, to a certain officer who at 11 o'clock one night wished to lodge 20 horses in our barn, or to 4 requisitioners who dragged us out of bed at 5 in the morning and forced us to dress in haste merely to prove we had no pigs. These same soldiers delighted to talk German with French women, tried to convince us that England was responsible for the war. "The whole world is against us," they said in a sulky voice, "the French, the English, the Russians, the Belgians." "But you are so numerous." "Not so numerous as all that." I remember also that we were once awaked by 2 drunken soldiers, who insisted upon our opening the window, and who at our refusal threatened and vociferated for an hour, promising to come back and set fire to the house. On the other hand, listen to the tragical, horrific history of one afternoon. It was a washing day. The charwoman had forgotten to close the gate. 2 or 3 of us were in the yard when a sergeant and 4 men made their appearance. Horses were waiting in the street. The sergeant was of lofty stature, stupid, grave, blue-eyed, and dark-bearded. He asked us if we could furnish lodgings for Herr Mayor and his 10 men. The honor was not tempting. We pleaded want of room. We wrapped up our obvious ill will in a mass of words. Antoinette carelessly pointed at the small room and hinted that we had no other left. The men withdrew, the horses rode away, and we sang songs of victory. But the following morning about 7 I heard a noisy knock at the door. I hastened out and reluctantly admitted the visitors of yesterday. From the top of his head the sergeant announced that Herr Mayor was very cross, furious even that we declined to receive him. He had sent the ruffians now to see how many rooms we might place at his disposal. I felt sure anxious ears were listening behind every shutter in the house. The alarm had been given, and the sluggards were making what speed they could. The fellows entered. The family gathered together, scared and haggard. A few of them were dressed, the others were in dressing gowns. The Germans examined the rooms whose morning disorder had been hastily concealed, and went up to the attic and down to the cellar. The sergeant then pronounced judgment in a solemn voice. We might have offered 5 bedrooms to the German army. 5 bedrooms, and we had but 5 rooms containing 5 beds. Where should we have slept? On straw with the dogs? That was a happy thought. And you would have offered Herr Mayor that small room overlooking the yard. Herr Mayor meant Now I've lost my place. As a matter of fact, we had offered Herr Mayor nothing, but the poor wretch was as much shocked as if we had proposed to lodge the crown prince in a pigsty. Well then, to punish us and to teach us the respect due to German officers, we were condemned to take into our house Herr Mayor and his 10 men. Death-like silence. A thunderbolt had fallen and struck us dumb. The soldier went on. Get dinner ready at 12:30. A table for one in the dining room, for men in the kitchen. At last we found our tongues. You talk of dinner, but we have no provisions to cook. Meat is not to be had at the butcher's. You will be provided with meat. We want wine, champagne. Champagne? We laughed in the face of the man. There is no wine in our cellar. We drink nothing but water. Anyhow, mind you do things properly. This was said in a threatening voice, and we made no reply. The sergeant had executed his mission, but he thought fit further to admonish us on his own account. Are you aware that the Germans are unwilling invaders? They did not want to make war. Who wished it? Can you doubt? It was England. Was it? Oh, really? And the civilians should be kind to the soldiers who are very well behaved. For instance, we ourselves all come of distinguished families. A private soldier is not necessarily a scoundrel. I know that, Geneviève answered. My brother is a soldier. But as patriots yourselves, you should understand that we are patriots too, and that it is painful for us to receive the enemy. The enemy! The enemy! The sergeant, bounding with rage, struck the pavement with the butt end of his gun. No, we are not the enemies of women and children. We know how to behave ourselves. While he discoursed, one of the young men of a distinguished family, standing on the staircase, caught sight of my husband's shoes on a shelf. He seized a pair and put one shoe into each pocket. Turning round, he encountered Yvonne's looks and hastily replaced his spoil. Twice, thinking himself unobserved, he recovered the shoes. But being too carefully watched, he gave it up as a bad job, and his superior officer concluded his speech in these words. If the French went to Germany, the civilians would receive them kindly. Indeed, I was pleased to hear it, but if the German women are ready to give a hearty welcome to our soldiers, and that is quite easy to understand, it does not follow that we ought to deal in like manner with their sons and husbands. We have never pretended to govern ourselves by the fashion of Berlin. At length they went away, and we had but to yield and prepare our saucepans. We would rather have given a dinner party to Gargantua and his family than prepare food for a German officer and 10 men just as German. We went to Madame Tassin in our extremity. She would surely come to our help, and in spite of rheumatism. The meat, about half an ox, was duly brought. Half of it was for soup, half to be roasted. In the wash-house, Madame Tassin made a gigantic soup flavored with 1,000 vegetables. In the kitchen, we peeled mountains of potatoes and prepared 2 bottles of French beans, which a soldier had brought in, stolen I know not where. Antoinette, uncorking one of the bottles, broke its neck and cut her finger. Her blood poured upon the beans. Hurrying to help her, I tore off a bit of my finger. Never mind, get on with the potatoes. At length, the work was finished. Huge and lean, wall-eyed and mouthed like a pike, Herr Mayor arrived with a happy nonchalance, and seated himself at the table. His attentive servant for very little would have served him on his knees. Dinner done, Herr Mayor required tea, and being presented with a teapot, he demanded a liqueur to flavor the tea. A few drops of rum were all that was left of an old bottle which happened to be in the dining room. I took it in. As distant as Sirius, I saluted the intruder. With a smile, Herr Mayor made a low bow. Something like intelligence lit up his pale eyes. He cleared his throat and faltered out, "The ladies would be safer in Paris than here." My mother-in-law stood by, thinking that too many things might have led them into temptation. At last they went away, Herr Mayor too. His servant informed us he would come down alone to supper, and that he desired eggs and pancakes. With slow steps the officer went down the street. Behind the buckler of our blinds we burst into bitter invectives. "Be off, you old cutthroat, you old scout, you grind the weak, you bully women, you have eaten my fingertip and drunk the blood of Antoinette. Cannibal, man-eater." The cannibal came back in the evening, ate a small pâté, was pleased with the poached eggs, and satisfied with the pancakes. Then he smoked his cigar at leisure, and all the while remained unconscious of severe eyes watching him from the garden. Yvonne and Colette made a wry face. "The sight of him is enough to make you sick. Fancy, I saw him put a whole egg into his mouth. His glass was covered with grease when he drank. Ugh!" The next day after, another tune was played. At 12 precisely, Herr Mayer arrived and calmly declared that, as his servant was out on urgent business, we must have the kindness to wait upon him ourselves. A pretty request, truly. Madame Tassin was nowhere. The omelette, done to a turn, was getting cold in the kitchen. Meanwhile, Herr Mayer was waiting in the dining room. It was high time that the dish should make the guest's acquaintance. I made up my mind. I will take his dinner to the man. Never! You wait at table? And upon a Prussian? He did it on purpose, of course. I persisted. I assure you I shall not deem myself degraded, and I promise you the man will feel uneasy sooner than I. So beneath Herr Mayer's haughty nose I put the omelette aux fines herbes. To the same nose I presented the roast veal with boiled potatoes, which is dear to all German hearts, and thought I might rest on my laurels. Then I saw that I had forgotten the sauce. Herr Mayer was chewing dry veal, sunk in melancholy. I put the sauce-boat on the table within reach of his hand. I had forgotten this. I am not in the habit. What did I say? Herr Mayer looked uneasy. He nearly begged my pardon. Indeed, I am afraid I disturb you. Ah, you deigned to notice it? And you might as well have dined at the village inn, but you don't think that you and your 10 gormandizers have reduced our stock of vegetables to nothing and swallowed up our last egg. But you have not always an officer at hand to give you information, and so I thought I might improve the occasion. What is the cannon, I asked, which thunders day and night in the south? We have been fighting in Crayon for the last 10 days, said he. The battle is said to be coming to an end, just before we were in Fimes. Herr Mayer pronounced Fismes. In a doleful tone he bewailed the evils of war. The regiment he belonged to had suffered 40% losses since the beginning of the war. He himself felt very ill. He had slept in the open air 7 rainy nights running. Had I any kinsmen in the war? Of course, my husband, and I get no news at all from him. That is the worst of all privations. Herr Mayer nodded assent. These partings were cruel. Frau Mayer, too, would have given a good deal to accompany Herr Mayer. As to ourselves, our situation might change for the better. It was, for instance, to our interest that the Germans should advance. The front would then be removed farther from us. I answered that we should welcome no such change for the better. But suppose that just the reverse happened. If the Germans were driven back, the front would also remove farther, wouldn't it? Oh, no, really, this war was stupid. England delights in making mischief, and the French are mad to enter into an alliance with the English, when another country was so eager to come to an agreement with them. France and Germany would get on well with each other. What then prevents a thoroughly good understanding? A mere nothing, sir. A grain of sand. Alsace-Lorraine, sir. Herr Mayer shrugged his shoulders. He had forgotten Alsace-Lorraine. His lunch was over. I asked if he intended to come and dine at our house. Again he seemed at a loss what answer to give. I'm not sure. I will let you know. His grey cloak streamed in the air, and Herr Mayer went away, never to return. Some days after I met him on the road. He bowed very low, and with a smiling face inquired after my husband. The double-faced fellow knew only too well I had not heard from him, but in common politeness I was fain to inquire also after his health. Herr Mayer was better, much better. In a week he would be back at the front, and if he happened to hear from my husband's regiment, he promised to send me news. And with many a bow, Herr Mayer smiled himself away. His face was not ever smiling. The peasants were terrified at his way of carrying out requisitions. On the other hand, it was rumored that he believed himself sprang from the thigh of Jupiter, of Wotan, and spoke to no one. The family did not fail to exercise its flippancy at my expense. They asked for the recipe of my philtres to charm Prussians. They urged me to write a treatise on the art of training Germans, and prophesied a fine future for me as a tamer of tigers. I did not mind being scoffed at. Too many cares claimed my attention. Besides, Barbu and Grafleux had just appeared in our orbit, but I am anticipating. Our chief anxiety was commonplace enough. The food problem was hard to solve. Fortunately, in spite of direful predictions, bread did not run short at the beginning of the war. Milk we had every day. Though Madame Lantois had been robbed of several cows, and though children were provided for first, she always gave us some. We had almost forgotten the taste of meat. Butter and cheese, hard to discover, were extravagantly dear, and eggs were as scarce as in Paris at the end of the siege. We had laid by a small provision of rice and macaroni, articles of food no more to be found in the shops, but we had decided to keep this reserve for extremities, in case, for instance, a bombardment kept us in the cellar. We all agreed to live from hand to mouth upon what we could come by. My reflections were profound when, after half a day's search, I found one egg, from which I had to concoct a dish for the whole family. You laugh? A proof that you lack imagination. With a single egg as a base of operations, you can make pancakes or apple fritters, flour fritters or bread fritters, or any fritters you like. By the way, I advise the use of nasturtiums. Rose leaves, on the other hand, are rather tasteless. But here is something better. You make some pastry, then beat up your one egg with a glass of milk, a few crumbs of bread, a bit of cheese, if you have any. Then you pour the mixture on the pastry, put the whole in the oven, and when it is baked you will find a dish that will feed 6 women. Oh, we made no complaints, not yet at least. Really, when a menu consists of a potato fricassee, to which laurel and thyme have given a zest, artichokes with melted butter and chalville, butter replaced by grease, alas, fresh salad and juicy pears, who would not pronounce himself satisfied with such a meal? Marmontel, who loved good cheer, Marmontel in the Bastille, where he so highly appreciated the fare, Marmontel himself would have been delighted with it. The want of light was the worst of our evils. Petroleum was no more to be had, and candles were hard to come by. Linseed oil and modest night lights grudged us a glimmer by which we gloomily went to bed. Therefore, as soon as the night fell, the fiend of melancholy seized upon us. The dull light spread a gloom over the room we sat in, and from the black corners dark thoughts seemed to rise and grow upon us. So we would rather walk in the garden, or even look out of the window when night fell, than sit at our work or our writing table. How many hours have I spent leaning out of the window in a nightgown and watching the shells burst? In September and October, just after the Germans' arrival, there were beautiful moonlit nights, worthy to be worshipped on bended knees, yet I felt an inclination to imitate Salambal and cry to the moon with arms uplifted. Oh, moon, I hate you. You are deceitful, unrelenting, and cold, and even the pale glimmer you send us you steal. There is nothing true but the warm and cheerful sunbeams which give us light and life. You fling your silver arrows when you please, and throw what you choose into the shade. You slip your sly rays into closed rooms, through cracks and chinks. No secret escapes you. You favor illicit love, unpunished crimes, acts of violence, and foul deeds. All these things you feast upon, O moon. But your light is never so pleasant, your caress never so soft as when you shine on a battlefield, on places where men kill one another. You take pleasure in the sight of dead bodies, shriveled limbs, wide open mouths, features distorted in the weird horror of death. You play on bloody weapons, on dark-mouthed cannon. You pass by the wounded, crying for help, by dying men whose death rattle is unheard, and you smile yourself from the charnel field, glad to leave the victims in the unfathomable shades of night. Moon, I hate you. Everywhere and always you have looked on murderous battles, unbrotherly contests, men maddened against man. You saw the formidable army of Xerxes contend with the Greeks. You saw the Roman Empire quivering at the onslaught of the barbarians. But can any sight you have ever witnessed be compared with that which you look down upon today? Europe in arms, cannon spreading death everywhere, thousands of men killed in the marshes of Poland, on the hills of Galicia, in France, on the plains of Flanders. Are you pleased, O moon? Moon, I hate you. To shun the moon, to shut out the sound of the guns, I close the wooden shutters, pull down the window, draw the curtains. The cannon are not silent. Chilled with cold and horror, I fling myself on my bed, bury my head in the pillows, creep under my blankets. The cannon still roars and shakes my bed. I wake up and the cannon roars louder than ever. To have lived and have been sometimes careless and merry, we must have been as mad and as blind as the moon herself. But we cannot attain to the moon's insensibility, and that is why our laughter often turns to tears and humor ends in a sob. That is the end of the chapter for today. Say bye-bye, Morven. I'll see you probably tomorrow.